Foreword. This seemingly neutral review of a vast body of material on contemporary science and problems of knowledge or information proves on closer inspection to be a kind of crossroads in which a number of different themes, a number of different books, intersect and problematize each other. For Jean-François Lyotard's discussion of the consequences of the new views of scientific research and its paradigms, opened up by theorists like Thomas Khun and Paul Feyerabend, is also a thinly veiled polemic against Jürgen Habermas's concept of a legitimation crisis and vision of a noise-free, transparent, fully communicational society. Meanwhile, the title of the book, with its fashionable theme of postmodernism provocatively in evidence, opens up this subject matter, at least by implication, in the directions of aesthetics and economics, since postmodernism, as it is generally understood, involves a radical break, both with the dominant culture and aesthetic, and with a rather different moment of socio-economic organization against which its structural novelties and innovations are measured. A new social and economic moment, or even system, which has variously been called media society, the society of the spectacle, Guy Debord, consumer society, or the société de consommation, the bureaucratic society of controlled consumption, Henri Lefebvre, or post-industrial society, Daniel Bell. It may also be assumed that this ostensibly technical and impersonal handbook is also a significant move in the development of Lyotard's own philosophical views, whose combative and prophetic voice, familiar to the readers of his other works, will surprise by its relative silence here. Finally, and closely related to this last, the postmodern condition presents us with significant methodological operations, which, although they draw on a whole very rich contemporary tradition of narrative analysis, nonetheless strike a relatively isolated and unusual note in the whole range of contemporary philosophical research. Lyotard's official subject matter, the status of science and technology, of technocracy and the control of knowledge and information today, is perhaps the most familiar material for the American reader, yet it opens immediately and instructively onto all the other themes I have just enumerated. Doing science, for instance, involves its own kind of legitimation. Why is it that our students do not do laboratory work in alchemy? Why is Immanuel Velikovsky considered to be an eccentric? And may therefore be investigated as a subset of the vaster political problem of the legitimation of a whole social order, a theme which, formulated in that particular code or terminology, is associated with the work of Habermas. Doing normal science and participating in lawful and orderly social reproduction are then two phenomena, better still, two mysteries, that ought to be able to illuminate one another. But as the term crisis in Habermas's title, as well as the prefix post in that of Lyotard, reminds us, legitimation becomes visible as a problem and an object of study only at the point in which it is called into question. As far as science is concerned, this crisis may be taken to be that of which the historical theories of Khun or Feyerabend stand as crucial symptoms. It would seem rather less important to decide whether those theories imply that we are now in a position to think or conceptualize scientific research in a very different way from the Newtonian period, or, on the contrary, that we now actually do science in a different way. At any rate, this break now links up with the other thematics of Lyotard's essay by way of an event generally taken primarily to be an aesthetic one, although it has relatively immediate philosophical and ideological analogues. I am referring to the so-called crisis of representation, in which an essentially realistic epistemology, which conceives of representation as the reproduction, for subjectivity, of an objectivity that lies outside it, produces a mirror theory of knowledge and art, whose fundamental evaluative categories are those of adequacy, accuracy, and the truth itself. It is in terms of this crisis that the transition, in the history of form, from a novelistic realism of the Lukácsian variety to the various, now classical, high modernisms, has been described. The cognitive vocation of science would, however, seem even more disastrously impaired by the analogous shift from a representational to a non-representational practice. Lyotard here ingeniously saves the coherence of scientific research and experiment by recasting its now seemingly non- or post-referential epistemology in terms of linguistics, and in particular of theories of the performative, J.L. Austin, for which the justification of scientific work is not to produce an adequate model or replication of some outside reality, but rather simply to produce more work, to generate new and fresh scientific énoncés or statements, to make you have new ideas. P.B. Medawar. Or, best of all, and returning to the more familiar aesthetics of high modernism, again and again to make it new. Au fond de l'inconnu pour trouver de nouveau. However this novel way of re-legitimizing contemporary science is understood or evaluated, and it has many family resemblances elsewhere in contemporary thought, it then retrospectively allows Lyotard to sketch a narrative analysis of the older forms of scientific legitimation, whose collapse in our own time imposes such desperate solutions, such remarkable last-minute salvage operations. The two great legitimizing myths or narrative archetypes, récits, are also something of a complication, in that they reproduce the denotative argument of the book in a connotative or auto-reference spiral. For the two great myths disengaged by Lyotard and identified as the alternate justifications for institutional scientific research up to our own period, that of the liberation of humanity and that of the speculative unity of all knowledge qua philosophical system, are also national myths, and reproduce the very polemic in which Lyotard's own book wishes to intervene. The first, political, militant, activist, is, of course, the tradition of the French 18th century and the French Revolution, a tradition for which philosophy is already politics, and in which Lyotard must himself clearly be ranged. The second is, of course, the Germanic and Hegelian tradition, a contemplative one, organized around the value of totality rather than that of commitment, and a tradition to which Lyotard's philosophical adversary, Habermas, still, however distantly, remains affiliated. The conflict can be dramatized and magnified if for these names we substitute even more prestigious ones whose philosophical differences are even more sharply articulated. Compare, for example, Gilles Deleuze's influential celebration of schizophrenia in books like The Anti-Oedipus, with T.W. Adorno's no less influential and characteristic denunciations of cultural reification and fetishization. The opposition can also be rotated in a psychoanalytic direction, in which case a characteristically French affirmation of the de-centered subject, or the illusion of the coherent self or ego, is set off against more traditional Frankfurt School defenses of psychic autonomy. Still, these traditions are not altogether so continuous or symmetrical as I have just suggested. Lyotard is, after all, writing in the wake of a certain French post-Marxism. That is, an enormous reaction on all levels against various Marxist and communist traditions in France, whose prime target on the philosophical level is the Hegel-Lukács concept of totality, often over-hastily assimilated to Stalinism or even to the Leninist party on the political level. Lyotard's own philosophical break with Marxism, he was a member of the important Socialisme ou Barbarie group in the 1950s and early 1960s, largely antedates this more recent, rather McCarthyist moment in France, itself since overtaken by the unexpected socialist landslide of 1981. But it clearly makes for a situation in which Habermas can still stand in for the totalizing and dialectical German tradition, while Lyotard's own philosophical relationship to the politicized French one has become far more problematic and complex. Indeed, I want to show a little later on that one significant libidinal subtext of the present volume consists of a symbolic effort to clarify this tangled plot as well. At any rate, Habermas's vision of an evolutionary social leap into a new type of rational society, defined in communicational terms as the communication community of those affected, who, as participants in a practical discourse, test the validity claims of norms and, to the extent that they accept them with reasons, arrive at the conviction that in the given circumstances the proposed norms are right, is here explicitly rejected by Lyotard as the unacceptable remnant of a totalizing philosophical tradition and as the valorization of conformist, when not terrorist, ideals of consensus. Indeed, insofar as Habermas will invoke a liberatory rhetoric as well, there is a sense in which, for Lyotard, this philosophical position unites everything that is unacceptable about both traditions and myths of legitimation. Before examining the position in terms of which such critiques are made, however, we must turn at least parenthetically to the methodological perspective developed here, in which legitimation is secured in terms of master narratives of the two types already described. The admission to France of such Anglo-American linguistic notions as that of Austin's performative is now largely an accomplished fact, although a rather unexpected development. In a more general way, the linguistic dimensions of what used to be called French structuralism, and the seemingly more static possibilities of a dominant semiotics, have in recent years been corrected and augmented by a return to pragmatics, to the analysis of language situations in games, and of language itself as an unstable exchange between its speakers, whose utterances are now seen less as a process of the transmission of information or messages, or in terms of some network of signs or even signifying systems, than as, to use one of Lyotard's favorite figures, the taking of tricks, the trumping of a communicational adversary, an essentially conflictual relationship between tricksters, and not as a well-regulated and noise-free passing of tokens from hand to hand. Mallarmé on denotative speech. We have already observed Lyotard's promotion of the performative to the very fundamental principle of contemporary science itself. What is even more striking in his methodological perspective, however, indeed, to my knowledge, he is one of the few professional philosophers of stature anywhere formally to have, although Paul Ricoeur and Alasdair MacIntyre also come to mind, drawn this momentous consequence, is the way in which narrative is affirmed, not merely as a significant new field of research, but well beyond that as a central instance of the human mind and a mode of thinking fully as legitimate as that of abstract logic. A lengthy methodological parenthesis defends this proposition, which at once itself becomes a kind of historical narrative in its own right, since, particularly in the context of a discussion of science, it is obvious that one of the features that characterizes more scientific periods of history, and most notably capitalism itself, is the relative retreat of the claims of narrative or storytelling knowledge in the face of those of the abstract, denotative, or logical and cognitive procedures generally associated with science or positivism. This parenthesis once again complicates the arguments of the postmodern condition insofar as it becomes itself a symptom of the state it seeks to diagnose, its own return to narrative arguments being fully as revealing an example of the legitimation crisis of the older cognitive and epistemological scientific worldview as any of the other developments enumerated in the text. Lyotard does indeed characterize one recent innovation in the analysis of science as a view of scientific experiments as so many smaller narratives or stories to be worked out. On the other hand, paradoxically, this revival of an essentially narrative view of truth and the vitality of small narrative units at work everywhere locally in the present social system are accompanied by something like a more global or totalizing crisis in the narrative function in general, since, as we have seen, the older master narratives of legitimation no longer function in the service of scientific research, nor, by implication, anywhere else. E.g., we no longer believe in political or historical teleologies, or in the great actors and subjects of history, the nation-state, the proletariat, the party, the West, etc. This seeming contradiction can be resolved, I believe, by taking a further step that Lyotard seems unwilling to do in the present text, namely to posit not the disappearance of the great master narratives, but their passage underground, as it were, their continuing but now unconscious effectivity as a way of thinking about and acting in our current situation. This persistence of buried master narratives in what I have elsewhere called our political unconscious, I will try shortly to demonstrate on the occasion of the present text as well. What is most striking in Lyotard's differentiation between storytelling and scientific abstraction is its unexpected modulation towards a Nietzschean thematics of history. In effect, indeed, for Lyotard, the fundamental distinction between these two forms of knowledge lies in their relationship to temporality, and in particular in their relationship to the retention of the past. Narrative, whose formal properties become magnified in prosody and in the rhythmic features of traditional tales, proverbs, and the like, is here characterized as a way of consuming the past, a way of forgetting. As meter takes precedence over accent in the production of sound, spoken or not, time ceases to be a support for memory to become an immemorial beating that, in the absence of a noticeable separation between periods, prevents their being numbered and consigns them to oblivion. Section 6. One recalls the great and still influential essay of Nietzsche on the debilitating influence of historiography and of the fidelity to the past and the dead that an obsession with history seems to encourage. The Nietzschean strength to forget the past in preparation for the mutation of the Superman to come is here paradoxically redeployed as a property of storytelling itself, of precisely those narratives, heroic or other, in which we have been taught to see a form of primitive data storage or of social reproduction. What this formulation does very sharply achieve, at any rate, is the radical differentiation between the consumption of the past in narrative and its storage, hoarding, and capitalization in science and scientific thought, a mode of understanding that, like the first surplus on the economic level, will little by little determine a whole range of ever more complex and extensive institutional objectifications, first in writing, then in libraries, universities, museums, with the first breakthrough in our own period to microstorage, computerized data, and databanks of hitherto unimaginable proportions, whose control or even ownership is, as Herbert Schiller and others have warned us, and as Lyotard is very well aware, one of the crucial political issues of our own time. We thus return to the thematics of science and knowledge in its social form. One that raises issues of social class is the technocracy produced by such a primacy of knowledge, of bureaucracy, or a whole new class, and of socio-economic analysis. Is this moment of advanced industrial society a structural variant of classical capitalism, or a mutation and the dawning of a wholly new social structure, in which, as Daniel Bell and other theoreticians of the concept of a properly post-industrial society have argued, it is now science, knowledge, technological research, rather than industrial production and the extraction of surplus value, that is the ultimately determining instance. In reality, two distinct and overlapping questions are raised simultaneously by these two interrelated theoretical problems, which to his credit Lyotard does seek here in peremptory fashion to resolve. The problem is finally that of the nature of a mode of production, and in particular the nature of the capitalist mode of production and the structural variations of which it is capable. The question may therefore be rephrased as a question about Marxism. Do the categories developed there for the analysis of classical capitalism still retain their validity and their explanatory power when we turn to the multinational and media societies of today with their third stage technologies? The persistence of issues of power and control, particularly in the increasing monopolization of information by private business, would seem to make an affirmative answer unavoidable and to reconfirm the privileged status of Marxism as a mode of analysis of capitalism proper. But the question has often been taken to involve a second set of answers or consequences as well, having to do with the end of capitalism, the possibility of revolution, and, first and foremost, the continuing function of the industrial working class as the fundamental revolutionary subject of history. It has, at least historically, been possible for intellectuals and militants to recognize the explanatory power of Marxism as the privileged mode of analysis of capitalism, including the particular social moment that is our own society, and, at one and the same time, to abandon the traditional Marxian vision of revolution and socialism, mainly out of a conviction that the industrial working class, in any case defined by its relationship to productive technologies of the first and second type, rather than the third, cybernetic or nuclear variety, no longer occupies the strategic position of power in this social formation. A stronger theoretical form of this proposition would then be derivable in the notion that social classes, of the classical type defined by Marxism, no longer function as such today, but are rather displaced by different non-class formations such as bureaucracy and technocracy, and this would seem to be the position of Lyotard, whose formative political work in the Socialisme ou Barbarie group turned precisely around the analysis of bureaucracy in the Eastern countries. The question of social class, and in particular of the proletariat and its existence, is hopelessly confused when such arguments conflate the problem of a theoretical category of analysis, social class, with the empirical question about the mood or influence of workers in this or that society today. They are no longer revolutionary, bourgeoisified, etc. More orthodox Marxists will agree with the most radical post- or anti-Marxist positions in at least this, that Marxism, as a coherent philosophy, or better still, a unity of theory and praxis, stands or falls with the matter of social class. What one can at least suggest here is that with Ernest Mandel's theorization of a third stage of capitalism beyond that of the classical or market capitalism analyzed in Capital itself, and that of the monopoly stage or stage of imperialism proposed by Lenin, there exists a properly Marxian alternative to non- or anti-Marxist theories of consumer or post-industrial society today, theories of which Daniel Bell's is no doubt the most influential. Mandel indeed undertakes to show that all of the features mobilized by Bell to document the end of capitalism as such, in particular the new primacy of science and technological invention, and of the technocracy generated by that privileged position, as well as the shift from the older industrial technologies to the newer informational ones, can be accounted for in classical Marxist terms, as indices of a new and powerful, original, global expansion of capitalism, which now specifically penetrates the hitherto pre-capitalist enclaves of third world agriculture and of first world culture, in which, in other words, capital more definitively secures the colonization of nature and the unconscious. This new period, 1940 to 1965, was characterized, among other things, by the fact that alongside machine-made industrial consumer goods, as from the early 19th century, and machine-made machines, as from the mid-19th century, we now find machine-produced raw materials and foodstuffs. Late capitalism, far from representing a post-industrial society, thus appears as the period in which all branches of the economy are fully industrialized for the first time, to which one could further add the increasing mechanization of the sphere of circulation, with the exception of pure repair services, and the increasing mechanization of the superstructure. This description is also quite consistent with the Frankfurt School's conception of the culture industry, and the penetration of commodity fetishism into those realms of the imagination and the psyche which had, since classical German philosophy, always been taken as some last impregnable stronghold against the instrumental logic of capital. What remains problematical about such conceptions, and about mediatory formulations such as that of Guy Debord, for whom the image is the last stage of commodity reification, is, of course, the difficulty of articulating cultural and informational commodities with the labor theory of value, the methodological problem of reconciling an analysis in terms of quantity, and in particular of labor time, or of the sale of labor power in so many units, with the nature of mental work and of non-physical and non-measurable commodities of the type of informational bits, or indeed of media or entertainment products. On the one hand, the posing of the category of mode of production as the fundamental one of Marxian social analysis, and the endorsement of a problematic that asks such systemic questions about contemporary society, would seem to remain essential for political people who are still committed to radical social change and transformation. Indeed, it is precisely as a contribution to this general problematic that Lyotard's little book is valuable, even though, as we shall see shortly, its author by no means counts himself among revolutionaries of the traditional kind. If the changing status of science and knowledge, and of its experts, leads us to the question about the nature of this mode of production as a system and a functional whole, this second, larger issue returns us, after a considerable detour, to the problem of culture, and in particular of the existence or not of some properly postmodernist culture. For although the category of the mode of production has sometimes been misunderstood as a narrowly economic or productionist one, its adequate solution clearly demands a structural examination and positioning of the superstructural levels of a given social formation, and, most urgently, the function and space to be assigned to culture itself. No satisfactory model of a given mode of production can exist without a theory of the historically and dialectically specific and unique role of culture within it. Here, Lyotard's sketch is tantalizing and finally frustrating, for the formal limitation of his essay to the problem of knowledge has tended to exclude an area, culture, that has been of the greatest importance to him in his other writings, as he has been one of the most keenly committed to contemporary thinkers anywhere to the whole range and variety of avant-garde and experimental art today. This very commitment to the experimental and the new, however, determine an aesthetic that is far more closely related to the traditional ideologies of high modernism proper than to current postmodernisms, and is indeed, paradoxically enough, very closely related to the conception of the revolutionary nature of high modernism that Habermas finally inherited from the Frankfurt School. Thus, although he has polemically endorsed the slogan of a postmodernism and has been involved in the defense of some of its more controversial productions, Lyotard is in reality quite unwilling to posit a postmodernist stage radically different from the period of high modernism and involving a fundamental historical and cultural break with this last. Rather, seeing postmodernism as a discontent with a disintegration of this or that high modernist style, a moment in the perpetual revolution and innovation of high modernism, to be succeeded by a fresh burst of formal invention. In a striking formula, he has characterized postmodernism not as that which follows modernism and its particular legitimation crisis, but rather as a cyclical moment that returns before the emergence of ever new modernisms in the strictest sense. There is then here reproduced something of the celebration of modernism as its first ideologues projected it, a constant and ever more dynamic revolution in the languages, forms, and tastes of art, not yet assimilated to the commercial revolutions in fashion and commodity styling we have since come to grasp as an imminent rhythm of capitalism itself, to which a later wave of more explicitly left-wing and often Marxist ideologues and aesthetes after World War II will add an explicit political dimension, so that the revolutionary aesthetic of the modern will sometimes be grasped by the Frankfurt School, but also by the Telkel and screen groups, in the more literal sense of critical negation, when not of outright social and psychological transformation. Lyotard's own aesthetic retains much of this proto-political thrust. His commitment to cultural and formal innovation still valorizes culture and its powers in much the same spirit in which the Western avant-garde has done so since the fin de siècle. On the other hand, it would seem that the assimilation of postmodernism to this older conception of high modernism and its negative, critical, or revolutionary vocation de-problematizes a far more interesting and complex situation, which is part of the dilemma posed by late capitalism, or consumer or post-industrial society, etc., in those other areas of science and technology, production, social change, and the like. Here it seems to me that Habermas, working to be sure within the far more suffocating and McCarthyist atmosphere of the Federal Republic, has a much keener sense of the political stakes involved in this seemingly theoretical matter than Lyotard has been willing to allow for. For Habermas, indeed, postmodernism involves the explicit repudiation of the modernist tradition, the return of the middle-class Philistine or Spießer rejection of modernist forms and values, and as such the expression of a new social conservatism. His diagnosis is confirmed by that area in which the question of postmodernism has been mostly acutely posed, namely in architecture, whose great high modernists, the architects of the international style, Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, were very precisely revolutionaries in the senses enumerated above, proponents of innovations in form and transformations in architectural space that could be expected in and of themselves to transform social life as a whole, and, by replacing political revolution, as Le Corbusier put it, to serve as the latter's substitute. But, in that form, the idea is as old as Schiller's aesthetic education of humankind. Postmodernism certainly means a return of all the old anti-modernist prejudices, as in Tom Wolfe's recent From the Bauhaus to Our House, but it was also objectively the recognition of a basic failure on the architect's own terms. The new buildings of Le Corbusier and Wright did not finally change the world, nor even modify the junk space of late capitalism. while the Mallarméan zero degree of Mies's towers quite unexpectedly began to generate a whole overpopulation of the shoddiest glass boxes in all the major urban centres in the world. This is the sense in which high modernism can be definitively certified as dead and as a thing of the past. Its utopian ambitions were unrealizable, and its formal innovations exhausted. This is, however, not at all the conclusion that Habermas and Lyotard draw from what they think of, in their different ways, as the postmodernist movement. For both of them, a return to the older critical high modernism is still possible, just as, equally anachronistically, for Lukács, writing in the thick of the high modernist period, a return to some older pre-modernist realism was still possible. Yet, if one is willing, as both Habermas and Lyotard are, to posit the emergence of some new state of social relations, even leaving aside the question of whether this is to be considered a whole new mode of production in its own right or not, then it does not seem particularly daring to posit some equivalent modification in the very role and dynamic of cultural production itself, something indeed one ought to be able to entertain dialectically, without any needless moralizing. Postmodernist architecture, for example, comes before us as a peculiar analogue to neoclassicism, a play of historicist allusion and quotation that has renounced the older high modernist rigor, and that itself seems to recapitulate a whole range of traditional Western aesthetic strategies. We therefore have a mannerist postmodernism, Michael Graves, a Baroque postmodernism, the Japanese, a Rococo postmodernism, Charles Moore, a neoclassicist postmodernism, the French, particularly Christian de Portsampac, and probably even a high modernist postmodernism, in which modernism is itself the object of the postmodernist pastiche. This is a rich and creative movement of the greatest aesthetic play and delight that can perhaps be most rapidly characterized as a whole by two important features. First, the falling away of the proto-political vocation and the terrorist stance of the older modernism. And second, the eclipse of all of the affect, depth, anxiety, terror, the emotions of the monumental, that marked high modernism and its replacement by what Coleridge would have called fancy, or Schiller aesthetic play, a commitment to surface and to the superficial in all the senses of the word. It was, however, precisely to the superficial, in all those senses, that a certain French post-structuralism invited us, not excluding the earlier works of Lyotard himself. This is, however, the moment in which aesthetics gives way to ethics, in which the problem of the postmodern, even in its relationship to new forms of science and knowledge, becomes that of one's more fundamental attitude toward the new social formation. The moment, finally, in which what I have called the deeper repressed or buried symbolic narrative of the postmodern condition comes at length into view. Lyotard's affiliations here would seem to be with the anti-Oedipus of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who also warned us at the end of that work that the schizophrenic ethic they proposed was not at all a revolutionary one, but a way of surviving under capitalism, producing fresh desires within the structural limits of the capitalist mode of production as such. Lyotard's celebration of a related ethic emerges most dramatically in the context of that repudiation of Habermas's consensus community already mentioned, in which the dissolution of the self into a host of networks and relations, of contradictory codes and interfering messages, is prophetically valorized. Section 4. This view, not surprisingly, will then determine Lyotard's ultimate vision of science and knowledge today as a search, not for consensus, but very precisely for instabilities, as a practice of paralogism, in which the point is not to reach agreement, but to undermine from within the very framework in which the previous normal science had been conducted. The rhetoric in which all this is conveyed is, to be sure, one of struggle, conflict, the agonic, in a quasi-heroic sense. Nor must we forget Lyotard's related vision of non-hegemonic Greek philosophy, the Stoics, the Cynics, the Sophists, as the guerrilla war of the marginals, the foreigners, the non-Greeks, against the massive and repressive order of Aristotle and his successors. On the other hand, aesthetics sometimes functions as an unpleasant mirror, and we need perhaps at least momentarily to reflect on the peculiar consonance between Lyotard's scientific free play and the way in which postmodernist architecture has taught us to learn from Las Vegas, Robert Venturi, and to make ourselves at home in our alienated being, Marx on Hegel's conception of absolute spirit. This is, at any rate, the deepest, most contradictory, but also the most urgent level of Lyotard's book, that of a narrative which, like all narrative, must generate the illusion of an imaginary resolution of real contradictions. Levi-Strauss. The formal problem involved might be expressed this way: how to do without narrative by means of narrative itself. On the political and social level, indeed, narrative in some sense always meant the negation of capitalism. On the one hand, for instance, narrative knowledge is here opposed to scientific or abstract knowledge, as pre-capitalism to capitalism proper. Yet, as became clear when the narrative legitimations of science itself were revoked at their moment of crisis and dissolution, narrative also means something like teleology. The great master narratives here are those that suggest that something beyond capitalism is possible, something radically different. And they also legitimate the praxis whereby political militants seek to bring that radically different future social order into being. Yet both master narratives of science have become peculiarly repugnant or embarrassing to first world intellectuals today. The rhetoric of liberation has, for example, been denounced with passionate ambivalence by Michel Foucault in the first volume of his History of Sexuality, while the rhetoric of totality and totalization that derive from what I have called the Germanic or Hegelian tradition is the object of a kind of instinctive or automatic denunciation by just about everybody. Lyotard's insistence on narrative analysis in a situation in which the narratives themselves henceforth seem impossible is his declaration of intent to remain political and contestatory. That is, to avoid one possible and even logical resolution to the dilemma, which would consist in becoming, like Daniel Bell, an ideologue of technocracy and an apologist for the system itself. How he does this is to transfer the older ideologies of aesthetic high modernism, the celebration of its revolutionary power, to science and scientific research proper. Now it is the latter's infinite capacity for innovation, change, break, renewal, which will infuse the otherwise repressive system with the disalienating excitement of the new and the unknown, the last word of Lyotard's text, as well as of adventure, the refusal of conformity, and the heterogeneities of desire. Unfortunately, the other conjoined value of the book's conclusion, that of justice, tends, as in all interesting narratives, to return on this one and undermine its seeming certainties. The dynamic of perpetual change is, as Marx showed in the manifesto, not some alien rhythm within capital, a rhythm specific to those non-instrumental activities that are art and science, but rather is the very permanent revolution of capitalist production itself, at which point the exhilaration with such revolutionary dynamism is a feature of the bonus of pleasure and the reward of the social reproduction of the system itself. The moment of truth, in this respect, comes when the matter of the ownership and control of the new information banks, the profitability of the new technological and information revolution, returns in these last pages with a vengeance. The dystopian prospects of a global private monopoly of information weighs heavily in the balance against the pleasures of paralogisms and of anarchist science, Feyerabend. Yet that monopoly, like the rest of the private property system, cannot be expected to be reformed by however benign a technocratic elite, but can be challenged only by genuinely political, and not symbolic or proto-political, action.